Let me begin with two caveats, pitfalls that I think we should be careful to avoid. It's very important to have this meeting about Gaza, one of the most disgraceful situations in the world. But we should remember that it's only in U.S. and Israeli policy that Gaza is separated from the West Bank. They're a unity, one unit, what's left of Palestine, 22% of the original mandate. Now, it's very important for the U.S. and Israel to separate the two and isolate them. For one thing, that means if there ever is some kind of a political settlement, the West Bank will be deprived of any access to the outside world. It will be imprisoned. It won't have a seaport. It'll essentially be contained by two enemies. So there is a strategic reason for the long-standing and intense effort to distinguish Gaza and the West Bank, to keep them apart, to ban transport, and also kind of ideologically to make them seem as if they're two different places. They aren't, outside of U.S.-Israeli ideology, and we should be careful not to resist that, I think. Another division that I think it's important to resist is between U.S. and Israel. So there's a lot of, we constantly talk, rightly, about Israeli crimes, but that's highly misleading because they are U.S.-Israeli crimes. There's nothing that Israel does that goes beyond what the United States authorizes and, in fact, directly supports with economic, diplomatic, military, and also ideological support. That is, by framing issues so that there is this First Amendment exception that Nancy mentioned. So these are U.S.-Israeli crimes. If we talk about Israel, we should remember we're talking about ourselves. It's not like talking about crimes of China. These are very important to keep in mind. Now, turning to Gaza and the West Bank, the separation of Gaza and the West Bank is part of a much more general policy, a policy of fragmentation of the residue of Palestine so that it cannot hope to emerge as a viable entity. Separating Gaza from the West Bank is one part of it. Gaza, as Nancy pointed out, has been converted into a prison. The screws are being steadily tightened so that it becomes a maximum security prison, something like Guantanamo. It's kind of a little odd on the side that there's been so much horror in the United States about Guantanamo. It's not very different from the maximum security prisons that the United States runs, and we're unique in the world, in the Western world, in having an incarceration system of this kind. So it's not just becoming a prison, it's becoming something like a maximum security prison, which is basically a torture chamber. It's under constant siege, very harsh and brutal siege. A siege is an act of war. Of all countries in the world, Israel surely is unusual in recognizing that. It twice launched a war on the grounds that 56 and 67, on the grounds that its access to the outside world was very partially restricted. That was considered a crime, and total siege is, of course, a much greater crime. So it's a major war crime that we're carrying out. Supplies, as you just heard, are restricted so that you have bare survival. There's constant and systematic attacks on all the borders, including the coastline, to drive the population inland. On the borders, that takes away the limited arable land. On the sea, what it has done is drive the fishing fleet to a couple of kilometers from the shore, where fishing is impossible because of the conditions that Nancy described. After the destruction of the sewage systems, the power systems, the other infrastructure, fish can't survive and people can't survive near the sea, so that destroys the fishing industry, and it contains Gaza even more narrowly. Again, part of the policy of imprisonment. It sounds like sadism, and it is, but it's kind of rational sadism. It's achieving a well understood and carefully planned the end of U.S. and Israeli policy. There are also regular atrocities, special atrocities, just to keep showing who's boss. So, end of September, Israeli troops entered northern Gaza and kidnapped 5 children, brought them over to Israel. They disappeared into the Israeli prison system. Nobody knows too much about it. It includes secret prisons, which occasionally surface. It's estimated that roughly 1,000 people are there, often for years, without any charge at all, just hidden away somewhere. So these kids probably joined that. All of this happens with total impunity, happens regularly. With complete impunity, that's part of our ideological contribution to ensuring the crushing of Palestinians. It's been going on for decades, in fact, in Lebanon and in the high seas. Israel has been hijacking boats on the way from Cyprus to Lebanon, capturing or sometimes killing passengers, taking them to Israel, keeping them as in prisons, sometimes for decades, sometimes as hostages for eventual release, no charges. Often we only barely know where they are by occasional surfacing of stories about secret prisons which aren't published in the United States, that they are in Europe and in Israel. And this is again done with complete impunity because we permit it. We say we're not going to talk about it, so therefore impunity. This is worth remembering when you read about the what's considered now one of the primary barriers to negotiations, the fate of an Israeli soldier, Gilad Shalit, who was captured at the border on June 25th, 2006. Well, capture of a soldier of an attacking army is some sort of a crime, I suppose. It doesn't rank very high among crimes. And against the background of constant hijacking of boats, kidnapping of civilians, killing of civilians on the high seas in Lebanon, it doesn't rank very high. And the situation is made even more dramatic by the fact that one day before Corporal Shalit was captured on the border, Israeli troops entered Gaza City, kidnapped 2 civilians, a doctor and his brother, spirited them across the border, and they too disappeared into the U.S.-backed Israeli secret prison system. And nobody's talking about negotiations to get them out. They're Arabs, so they have no human existence. So we don't talk about them, and in fact it was barely reported here because it's insignificant. But that's worth... Shalit ought to be returned in a prisoner exchange, but that's a toothpick on a mountain, but the one that we talk about. And other crimes just go on regularly. Like a few days ago, you may have read that Israel banned the shipment of cooking gas into Gaza. Just an act of gratuitous cruelty. It means that it's used for almost everything. So that's gone. The water system is under very severe attack. The International Committee of the Red Cross and the UN Environmental Protection Agency, which work there, estimate that by now only maybe 5 to 10% of the water, the very limited water in the Strip, is used.